They told you bloodlines die clean, that empires fall with thunder and fire, and the bodies of kings arranged neatly for the history books. They lied. The Northern Empire wasn't taken by war. It was taken by a dinner invitation, by poisoned wine, by guards who looked the other way because someone paid them better than loyalty ever could. 18 years of stolen banners, 18 years of a throne sitting on top of a grave. And somewhere out beyond the Frostwood, past the reach of every assassin Varric Draven ever sent, something survived that wasn't supposed to. Watch until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. The trap had been set for a fox. Lyanna Vale found the silver cub at dawn, 3 miles past the eastern tree line, where the Frostwood pressed hard against the frozen creek she used for washing. The cold that morning had teeth. Not the polite cold of early autumn that reminds you to pull a coat, but the grinding structural cold of deep northern winter that works its way through layers and settles into bone like it means to stay permanently. Her breath came out in plumes. Her fingers, even wrapped in doubled wool, had gone numb around the water bucket before she made it 50 yards from her cabin door. She heard him before she saw him. Not a scream. Something worse. A sound that had given up on screaming and settled into the low, exhausted register of an animal that had been fighting for a long time and was starting to lose the argument. She put the bucket down in the snow. The cub was small, maybe 8 weeks, maybe 10. Silver white against the gray morning with a coat that should have made him invisible in fresh snow, but instead caught the pale light and held it the way certain metals hold fire. His right foreleg was caught in the iron jaw of a leg-hold trap, the kind that the hunters from Coldwater Township used when they were too lazy to check their lines for 3 or 4 days at a stretch. The fur around the trap was dark. He had been pulling against it. Lyanna moved slowly, the way she had learned to move around injured things. Slow was not timid. Slow was something else, a studied removal of threat from the air, something her mother had shown her before the fever took her, a language made entirely of patience and stillness. The cub tracked her with his eyes. Gold. Not amber, not the warm brown yellow of common wolves. Gold, the color of something old and definite, the color of the imperial seals she had seen once on an official document that passed through the market at Ashfield when she was 11 years old. Eyes that did not look away, eyes that did not ask for help the way injured animals usually did, with that shivering, unfocused desperation. These eyes assessed her, calculated, waited. She stopped 4 feet away and crouched down until she was below his eye line. "All right," she said, to no one in particular. "All right." She had said that word in the same flat, accepting tone on the morning she found her second goat dead from the cold. She had said it when the roof of the storage shed collapsed under 3 feet of wet spring snow. She said it the way people say it when they have arrived at a fact they did not choose and cannot change, but have decided to deal with anyway. She pulled off her outer wool glove and tucked it under her arm. Her bare hand she held out, palm upward, fingers loose, 6 inches from the cub's muzzle. He smelled her. She felt the warmth of his breath against her skin, felt the tiny, precise sting of his cold nose touching the heel of her palm, felt the moment, almost imperceptible, when the tension went out of his shoulders. Not trust, not yet. Something more preliminary than trust. A kind of provisional suspension of the decision to bite. She reached past him slowly, both hands, found the spring mechanism of the trap, and pressed the release plate simultaneously the way you had to, counterintuitively, pressing down to open. The trap fell away. The cub did not run. That was the first thing that was wrong about him. Every injured wild animal Lyanna had ever handled had run the moment it was free, regardless of the state of the leg, regardless of the cold, regardless of the fact that running on a damaged limb in that temperature would almost certainly kill it. They ran because freedom and survival had been synonymous for so long in their blood that the two things were indistinguishable. The instinct preceded every other consideration. This one sat. He looked at his freed leg, at the dark matted fur, the swelling already pronounced beneath it, and then he looked back at her, the gold eyes steady. Patient in a way that animals were not patient, patient in the way that something waiting for a specific outcome was patient, rather than something simply enduring. "You can't walk on that," Liana said. He watched her. "I live about 3 miles back." She glanced at the tree line, calculated. "I have a fire. Bandages. Something for the pain if you'll let me near enough." She stood slowly, then gathered her coat around herself and held it open at one side, creating a hollow of warmth against her body. He considered this for a long moment. Then he moved toward her, placed his uninjured front paw on her knee for balance, and let her lift him. She carried him home through the snow. She named him Kyle on the 3rd day, when it became apparent he was staying. She had not intended to name him. She had intended to treat the leg, keep him warm until the healing was well established, and then release him back to wherever silver wolves went, which was, as far as she knew, nowhere near the Frostwood. Silver coats and wolf cubs were rare to the point of being legend in this part of the north. The hunters around Coldwater talked about them the way men talk about things they have heard about but never actually seen, with a kind of aggressive skepticism that was really just envy wearing a practical face. The name came because of the way he moved through the cabin, not tentatively, the way new animals moved in new spaces, noses trailing the ground, bodies low and anxious with the effort of mapping an unfamiliar territory. He moved through it like he was memorizing it, precise and unhurried, sitting still in doorways for long minutes, positioning himself against the north wall of the main room where he could see both the front door and the window simultaneously, which was not an 8-week-old wolf cub's instinct. That was a sentry's instinct, a commander's instinct. She had known one person in her life who moved through rooms that way, a man named Caleb Rath, a retired soldier who had come through her village 6 years ago and stayed a winter season, doing odd repairs in exchange for food. He used to sit in that same deliberate way in the tavern, back to the wall, sightlines clear. And she had thought at the time that it was the saddest kind of habit, the kind your body holds on to long after the reason for it is gone. Cale it was. He healed faster than he should have. She had seen dog bites and trap injuries both, knew how long they took even with good treatment, knew the particular progression of inflammation and tissue recovery that you could not meaningfully accelerate through any method available to a healer working with what the Frostwood offered. By the 5th day, he was bearing partial weight on the leg. By the 8th, he was walking without favoring it. By the 12th, when she checked the fur and skin carefully in the firelight, she found nothing. Not healing scarring, not new fur growing over a wound, nothing. Unblemished silver coat all the way through, as if the trap had been a bad dream that the leg itself had simply decided not to remember. She sat back and looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her. "What are you?" she said. He put his head down on his forepaws. "Shrats." The first snow of the deep season came in the 3rd week of his being there, a real snow, not the testing preliminary flurries of early winter, but a full northern siege that shut the world down for 5 days. The drifts reached the 2nd horizontal log of her cabin wall. The temperature dropped to the kind of number that stopped having meaning and became simply a quality of the air, the quality of being dangerous outside without very specific preparation. She didn't mind. She had enough wood. She had provisions, dried and smoked and stored, enough for herself through a full hard winter with room left over. She had her workbench and her herbs, her mortar and pestle, the small glass bottles she traded healing work for at the market, the worn notebooks in which she kept her formulary, her plant records, her observations about what worked and what didn't, and under what conditions. Cale learned about the workbench on day 2 of the snow siege. He jumped onto it from the floor, which was a jump he had no business clearing given his size, landed with perfect precision among the bottles and tools, and sat. He sniffed at the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling. He observed her working with an attention that made her self-conscious in a way she was not accustomed to being, alone in her own space. "You're in my light," she told him. He moved 6 inches to the left. "That's..." She paused. "Did you just actually..." He was already looking at the dried herbs again. She went back to work. That evening, crouched beside the fire with her bowl of grain and the last of her preserved summer berries, she watched him sleep in the corner he had claimed. The northeast corner, always the same corner, back protected by 2 converging walls. And she thought about what it meant that she had not been lonely in 3 weeks. She had been alone in the Frostwood cabin for going on 4 years, which was the choice she had made and did not regret making. But loneliness was a separate thing from solitude, and she had not, until recently, distinguished clearly between them. She was not lonely now. She was not sure what to do with that information. So, Celine Morrigan came in late winter, and she came on foot through the snow, which meant she had either arrived by some means other than the road, or she was made of something other than ordinary human material. She was old enough that it was hard to say how old, somewhere in the territory past 60, where the distances between decades stopped being legible on a face and became something more general, a quality of settledness. Her hair was white and she wore it loose, which no one in the north wore their hair because of wind. She seemed not to notice the wind. Liana heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow and went to the window, and her first thought was that whoever was out there was going to die if she didn't open the door. Her second thought, a fraction of a second behind, was that the figure moving through the snow without apparent difficulty did not look like someone who was going to die. She opened the door. Cale was already standing at her left knee, and he was not showing threat. No raised hackles, no low warning rumble in the chest. He was standing the way he stood when he was paying attention to something he considered significant, which was different from the way he stood when he was afraid, different from the way he stood when he was simply alert. This was a different configuration entirely, one she had not seen him use before. Something close to, she would have said recognition if it had made any sense. The old woman stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "There you are," she said, and her voice was the voice of someone finishing a sentence begun a very long time ago. Liana stepped to one side. "Come in." "I was hoping you'd say that. It's remarkable that you did." Celine came inside and shed the outer layer of a cloak that should have been inadequate for this weather, looked around the cabin with the calm appraisal of someone taking inventory. "You've kept it warm. I wasn't certain you would. It's winter." "Many things die in winter by the choice of those who could have kept them warm." Her eyes came to Liana's, and they were gray, the particular gray of old river ice. "You didn't." "Who are you?" "My name won't mean anything to you yet. It might later." She settled herself into the chair nearest the fire with the ease of someone who was used to making herself at home in other people's spaces because the alternative was freezing. "Celine Morrigan. I was a seer at the Imperial Court before the Imperial Court became something none of us would have recognized as itself." The air in the room changed. Cale sat down. Liana did not sit down. "The Imperial Court hasn't had a seer in 18 years. The Emperor purged the seer line in the first year of his reign. Purged is an ambitious word for what he managed to accomplish. He killed most of them, yes. I left before he got to me, which cost me quite a lot." She said this without apparent bitterness, which was more disturbing than bitterness would have been. "I've been looking for the boy for 11 years. The fire crackled. The wind hit the north wall. "What boy?" Liana said. Celine looked at Cale. Liana looked at Cale. Cale looked at Celine with those gold eyes, and in the firelight there was something in his face that she could not have described accurately if pressed, but the closest she could come was gravity. The look of something that had been carrying a weight for a very long time without being able to name it, and had just heard it named. "I need you to tell me," Celine said, not to Liana, not as a question, "whether you understand what I am saying." The cabin was quiet. Cale dipped his head. A single, controlled movement. The hair on the back of Liana's arm stood up. The story Celine told was not short, and she told it in the way of someone who had rehearsed the telling to the point where the words came without effort, because the effort was all in what the words held and not in their arrangement. The Alpha King and his queen had died on the 14th of the harvest month, 18 years prior. In the palace they had opened for a celebration of the Autumn Treaty renewal that Emperor Varric Draven had proposed as a gesture of new alliance. The Alpha Emperor had trusted Varric because the evidence of betrayal was hidden, carefully, beneath months of accumulated demonstration of loyalty. The guests were killed in their seats at the long tables by men who entered through the service corridors. The palace guard was already dead by then, every single one of them, every post. "Not chaos," Liana said. "No, surgical. Celine's hands were in her lap. They did not move while she talked. Everything arranged so that the death count reached full coverage before the alarm could be raised. 12 minutes from the first blow to the last. They had measured it beforehand. They had practiced. On the staffs of 2 minor houses who were never investigated because their deaths were ruled illness. She looked at the fire. There was one miscalculation, there always is. The royal nursemaid, a woman named Asha who had served the queen for 9 years, was not in the nursery that night. She had taken the infant prince out through the garden access 3 hours before the celebration began because he was colicky, and she believed the night air would help. She was not part of the seating plan. She was not in any room that any assassin had been assigned to clear. The fire. The wind. Kale, still and watching. She ran, Celine said. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, and then she found a seer she trusted. And the seer put the only protection left in the world around that child. The strongest concealment available. It burned her out completely. The seer who cast it. She didn't survive the casting. Asha brought the boy to me 2 days later and died of exhaustion getting him there. By the time I had him, he was already changing. The enchantment, Liana said. The enchantment was not meant to hide a human child. It was meant to hide a wolf cub. Because that was the only logic that worked. An alpha heir in human form could not be disguised enough, could not be hidden anywhere that Varric's people would not eventually find him because they knew what they were looking for. A silver cub, wandering, unlikely to survive the winter, in a world full of other wolves. She stopped. Is almost invisible, Liana said. Is completely invisible, until he is not. Liana looked at him, at the silver coat, the gold eyes, the way he sat in the corner of her cabin, with his back to 2 walls and watched every doorway. How long? She said. Until the enchantment reaches its natural end. It was designed with a terminus, but it could not hold forever. Nothing of that magnitude can. It holds until either the child is old enough to survive the truth, or until someone worthy of holding it invokes the... Celine paused, and the pause was weighted. Invokes a specific quality of loyalty, freely, without knowledge of what it means. Liana felt something shift in her chest, not a pleasant shift, a shift like weight redistributing on a structure that had been told it needed to bear more than it had been designed to bear. You didn't know, Celine said. That's important. It had to be without knowledge. It's the one condition the enchantment required. Someone had to choose him without knowing what they were choosing. You said someone worthy. The enchantment doesn't care about lineage or title or strength. It cares about the nature of the choice. Celine's gray eyes were steady. You found an injured animal in a trap in the winter dark, miles from your home, in a forest where nothing should have survived, and you chose to carry him back. You chose warmth over fear. You chose the cost over the convenience of walking past. The fire was burning lower. Liana didn't move to add wood. There are people looking for him, she said. Yes. How close? 3 weeks, perhaps 4, before the information reaches the hunters that were sent north in the autumn survey. Someone talked at a market, which is how information always travels eventually, regardless of how careful everyone tries to be. Celine's hands finally moved, folding together. They won't find a silver cub immediately. They'll find the rumors of a silver cub, and they'll work backward from there. Eventually, they will work back to Coldwater Township and then to the Frostwood, and then to a healer who lives alone 3 miles from the Eastern Creek. What do I do? It was not a question that asked for comfort. It was a question that asked for logistics. Celine looked at her for a long moment with those river ice eyes. What you've been doing, she said. That's what you do. What you choose to do past the point where what you've been doing becomes dangerous is a separate question, and I won't answer it for you because I can't. That has to be yours. Celine stayed 4 days and left the way she arrived, through the snow, without apparent difficulty, and without telling Liana where she was going. She left behind 2 things, a small flat stone with markings on it that she said would alert her if the hunters came closer faster than anticipated, and an absence that was heavier than her presence had been. The cabin felt different after she left. Kale felt it too. He didn't return to the northeast corner for 2 days, moved restlessly around the space instead, stopping at the window more than usual, pressing his nose to the cold glass and looking out at the white world beyond it, with an expression that Liana now interpreted differently than she had before. Not simple animal awareness of weather and territory. Something more complex. A prince looking at a world that was, technically, his inheritance and finding it entirely inaccessible to him. She watched him at the window one evening in the blue late afternoon dark and said, "I'm not going anywhere." He turned to look at her. "I want to be clear about that. I know I'm not supposed to be. I know you didn't ask for this. I know it's not my place to make you promises. I don't know what the right word is for what I am to you, but I'm not going anywhere." She stopped, considered. "And neither are you. Not until you're ready, whatever that means." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he crossed the room and lay down against her feet, which he had never done before, and put his head on his forepaws. And she sat with that weight against her. Warm, alive, the particular heaviness of something that has put its trust somewhere and decided to rest. Until the fire needed wood, and she got up carefully so as not to disturb him, and added 2 logs, and sat back down on the floor beside him instead of returning to the chair. They stayed that way until the snow stopped. The marker stone warmed in her pocket on a morning in late winter, 7 weeks after Celine had gone. Not hot, just warm, a noticeable warmth, the way a coal warms a pocket when you tuck one in for a winter walk, specific and deliberate. Liana was standing at the workbench grinding dried willow bark when she felt it, and her hand went to it automatically. She held it, felt the warmth pulse once, and then settled to a steady low heat. She looked at Kyle. He was already standing. "Faster than she thought," Liana said. He had his head low, not in threat but in focus, and the quality of the air around him had shifted in the way it sometimes shifted when he was paying attention to something she couldn't perceive, some frequency of information coming in through channels she didn't have. His nostrils were working. His gold eyes were directed not at the door, but at the north window, which was not the direction of Coldwater Township. The soldiers were not coming from Coldwater Township. "How far?" she said, the way she might have asked herself, thinking out loud. He looked at her, and then deliberately toward the north wall, and then back. "North Road," she said. "So they came around." She set down the mortar and did not waste time on fear, which was a luxury she was not going to give herself. She crossed to the fireplace and moved the loose stone in the hearth and pulled out the tin box she kept there. Coin, documents, a small knife. She put the knife in her belt and left the coin. She went to the shelf and took down the medicine bag she kept packed for emergencies. She pulled her heaviest cloak off the hook. Then she stopped. Cale was watching her. She looked at the bag, at the door, at him. "I could run," she said. "We could both go, north past the deep frostwood." "They don't have anyone past the tree line in winter," Celine said. She stopped herself, looked at the cabin, the workbench where she had spent 4 years building something, the notebooks, the bottles, the fire she had kept burning. She thought about Asha, running until she couldn't anymore. She thought about the seer who had cast everything she had into one protection and not survived the effort. She thought about Celine walking through the snow for 11 years looking for this specific child, who was the specific hope of an empire that had been bleeding from a wound it didn't know how to close. She thought about what it cost to choose the right thing and then spend the rest of your life pretending you'd chosen it because it was easy. "No," she said. "No, we're not running." She hung the medicine bag back on its hook. She folded the cloak and set it down. She picked up the short-handled axe from beside the wood stack, turned it once in her hands, and set it within reach near the door, but not obviously so. Then she straightened, squared herself, and waited. The sound came 12 minutes later, hoofbeats, more than 4 horses. She counted the rhythm of hooves and arrived at something between 8 and 12, which was not a patrol. A patrol was 4. This was a company. She opened the door before they knocked on it. There were 10 of them. Imperial insignia on their armor. Not the old imperial insignia, the silver and gold crown that had meant something once. The new crest. Varric's crest. A black wolf with a broken chain, which she had always thought was about as honest as usurpers got about their own nature. The man at the front was not the largest among them, but held himself with the specific confidence of someone who expected to be listened to. Short beard, eyes the color of winter mud. "Liana Vale," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "You're the healer." "That's right." He looked past her into the cabin. His eyes found Cale immediately, silver against the dimness, gold eyes catching the firelight. "That's a large animal to keep in a house," he said. "He found me," she said, "injured, in a trap." "And you treated it." "That's what I do." The soldier in winter mud eyes took his time. She could see him cataloging, adding things up, arriving at a calculation. She kept her own face still, not the stillness of innocence, not the overmanaged stillness of someone performing calm, just the ordinary flat steadiness of someone who had been alone in the Frostwood for 4 years and had run out of the kind of anxiety that required an audience to sustain it. "There are reports," the officer said, "of a silver wolf cub seen in this region of the Frostwood. Unusual coloring, large for its age. I've seen ordinary wolves. Gray-brown coats, usual markings. This one would be distinct. I tend to notice distinct things." He looked at her for a long time. "The Empire is searching for a specific animal, one of significance. The Emperor has issued orders for the animal's preservation. Any individual aiding in that animal's location will be generously compensated. Any individual found to be concealing it—" He let the pause do the work the word would have done less efficiently. Liana looked back at him. "I understand." "Do you?" Very clearly. She held his eyes, held them, did not look away. "I haven't seen anything unusual in the Frostwood. If I do, I'll send word to the garrison at Coldwater." He studied her face. Behind her, from inside the cabin, came no sound, no movement, just Cale, standing in her healer's cabin in the northeast corner where the walls met, golden eyes open, waiting. The officer looked past her one more time, long and slow and professional. Then he pulled his horse back 2 steps. "We'll be surveying the region for the next month. If your memory improves, Vale." He left it there. She nodded. She stood in the open doorway and watched them ride north until the sound of hooves faded and then faded further, and then she couldn't hear them anymore. The cold came in past her, into the cabin, and for a long moment she didn't move. Then Cale was at her side, pressing against her leg, warm and solid and present. She put one hand down into the silver fur at his neck. "All right," she said. Her hand was shaking. She hadn't noticed while the soldiers were there. Her hand was shaking now. "1 month," she said. He said 1 month. She crouched down beside him, both hands in his coat now, not for his warmth, but for her own steadiness, which she was not going to apologize for. "We need to think differently about what 1 month means." She was looking at his eyes when it happened. It was not gradual. There was no slow bleed of change, no incremental shift she could have tracked if she had been watching for it. One moment his eyes were the deep animal gold she had been looking at for 6 weeks. And then, between one breath and the next, the gold brightened. Not with reflected firelight, from within. Like something that had been under pressure finding, finally, the exact threshold that pressure required. The markings appeared beneath his fur. Not on it. Beneath. As if the silver coat were a scrim, and what was beneath it had its own light. Lines and angles running along his flanks and up his spine and across his chest. The geometric precision of a mark she had seen once in her childhood, in an illustration in a book that had passed through the market in Ashfield, a book of old histories that the seller had priced at an amount no one in Ashfield could pay. Imperial bloodline marks. The markings of the Alpha line. The ones that had not existed in the world for 18 years because the body that carried them had died on the 14th of the harvest month at a dinner table in a palace. Liana Vale, alone in the Frostwood with her shaking hands and her open door and her 10-soldier problem growing smaller in the northern distance, looked at the light under the fur of the creature pressed against her leg. She understood, with the complete absence of drama that true understanding usually brought, exactly what was coming. 1 month. 1 month before they came back with more men, better orders, and a specific description of what they were looking for. 1 month before the marker stone stopped being warm and started being hot. 1 month before the choice she had already made in the cabin became a choice that the entire world would have to reckon with. The light beneath his fur pulsed, and in the trees to the north, distant, carried on the wind that had not stopped blowing since the soldiers left, a sound rose. Not one wolf, more than one wolf. A sound she had never heard from the frostwood in 4 years of living beside it. A sound she had not known living wolves still made, because she had thought that particular call had gone out of the world with the dynasty that inspired it. The call of gathered wolves acknowledging their alpha, acknowledging for the first time in 18 years that the bloodline lived. The howling didn't stop. It layered, one voice finding another and another until the sound had mass, had direction, came at the cabin from 3 sides simultaneously, like something that had been waiting in the dark for a specific signal and had finally received it. Liana stayed crouched on the floor with both hands buried in silver fur and felt the vibration of it through the boards beneath her knees, through the walls at her back, through the air itself. Not threatening, the opposite of threatening. It was the sound of a debt being acknowledged by parties who had been waiting 18 years to pay it. She had never heard anything like it, and she understood it completely. Kale was trembling, not fear. She knew fear in animals, knew the specific quality of muscle that locked up under threat, the shallow, rapid breathing, the whites that showed at the edges of the eyes. This was different. This was the trembling of something being asked to hold more than it had ever held, the trembling of a vessel that had been ordinary-sized its whole life being told it was actually something else, something with a different capacity than it had ever been allowed to use. She tightened her hands in his fur. "I've got you," she said. Not a promise she had the authority to make. She made it anyway. The light under his fur pulsed a second time, steadier now, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Outside, the howling peaked and then, all at once, stopped. The silence after it was enormous. She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire instead with the axe across her knees. Not because the axe was going to matter. She was not deluded about what 10 armed soldiers represented versus 1 woman with a short-handled axe, but because having it there gave her hands something to do besides shake. She went through the facts the way she went through a complicated formula. What she knew. What she didn't know. What the margin for error was. What she knew, 10 soldiers. 1 month, the officer had said. A regional survey. They had believed her, or had believed her enough to leave, which was not the same thing, but was functionally equivalent for now. The stone in her pocket was warm, not hot. The marker Celine had described as hot meant proximity, meant hours. Warm meant distance, days, still. She had days. What she didn't know, whether they had someone positioned outside her sight line while the officer talked to her, whether word had already gone south to the garrison, whether 1 month was an estimate or a reassurance designed to make her stay put until they returned with better resources. What she didn't know, more precisely, everything. Everything about this. About the boy sleeping in silver fur in her northeast corner, about what the markings under his coat meant in practical terms, about what changed now that they had manifested, about what Celine had meant by the enchantment reaching its natural end, about what an alpha heir in revealed form was capable of, about what he would need, about who would come. At some point well before dawn, Kale got up from the corner and crossed the cabin and lay down against her left side, the full warm length of him against her hip, and she did not tell him to move. She looked at the markings under his fur in the firelight. They had not faded. They glowed low and steady, like something living, like the particular orange-white light at the heart of a coal long after the flame had gone. Geometric. Precise. She tried to remember the illustration from the book in Ashfield. She had been 11. She had barely looked at it. It had been a page from a history that an adult had told her was propaganda anyway. She remembered lines. She remembered that the lines followed the spine. She had been carrying an empire, and she had not known it. She thought about that for a while without flinching from it, because flinching didn't help anything, and she was not in the habit of it. He was different in the morning. It was not something she could have pointed to in any single feature. His size had not changed. His coat was the same silver. He moved through the cabin in the same deliberate way, stopping at the same windows, angling for the same sight lines. But there was a quality to his stillness that had shifted, the way the quality of air shifts in the last hour before a major storm. Nothing visible yet, just a pressure change that the body registers before the mind does. He was not a wolf cub hiding in a wolf cub's skin anymore. He was something that knew what it was, standing in a wolf cub's body, holding the knowledge steady. She watched him assess the north window and said, "We have to talk about what happens next." He turned to look at her. "I'm not Celine. I don't know what the rules are for this, for what you are, for what those marks mean, for what happens when the enchantment ends all the way." She put her bowl down on the table. "What I know is that we have a limited amount of time before that officer decides his timeline was too generous. And I know that hiding doesn't work past a certain point. You can't hide something that doesn't want to stay hidden anymore." His ears moved. She had learned his ears over 6 weeks. "Is that what's happening? Is the hiding part done?" He held her eyes for a long time. Then he walked to the door and sat in front of it and looked back at her. She sat with that for a moment. "You want to go out?" His ears stayed forward. "The howling last night. You want to—" She stopped. Thought about the sound coming from 3 directions, the number of voices in it. "There are wolves in the frostwood that know what you are." He didn't look away. She pushed back her chair and stood up and went to get her coat. He moved through the snow differently outside than he moved through it on their ordinary walks. He had always been more deliberate than a wolf his age should have been. She had marked it without fully understanding it. But this was something past deliberate. He moved like he was walking a map he had always known, taking turns through the trees that she would not have predicted, leading her northeast and then due north, and then through a break in the timber she had never found on her own, despite having walked these particular 3 miles of frostwood for 4 years. She followed. The clearing was not large, by maybe 30 yards across, oval-shaped, the timber closing around it with the specific intentionality of trees that have been growing around a space long enough that the space seems to have been designed. The snow in it was unmarked, or it had been, before they arrived, before the others arrived. There were 7 of them, all wolves, all adults, gray-brown coats, ordinary markings, the working wolves of a northern forest pack, heavy through the shoulders with winter fur, standing in an arrangement that took her brain a moment to parse and then another moment to accept. They were not distributed randomly through the clearing. They were positioned, flanking. Left side and right side, 3 and 3, with a 7th at the far end of the oval who stood slightly forward of the others, slightly larger, with a scar running through the fur at his left shoulder. They were standing in formation. Liana had never seen wolves stand in formation. She stopped at the tree line. Kale walked forward into the clearing. The 7 wolves watched him come. Their attention was absolute. Not the tracking attention of predators, but the focused attention of parties who have gathered for a specific purpose and are waiting for the principal to arrive. The scarred wolf at the far end lowered its head as Kale crossed into the center of the clearing. Then the 3 on the left. Then the 3 on the right. Not hunting behavior. Not pack hierarchy behavior. Liana watched 7 adult wolves bow their heads to an 8-week-old silver cub and felt the ground shift under the category of things she was certain about. Kale stood in the center of the clearing, the markings on his flanks visible even at distance in the gray morning light, and he was absolutely still. He was not performing this. He was not commanding it. He was simply receiving something that was already his, and the receiving was serious. And the seriousness of it was the most adult thing Liana had ever seen in a face that still had the round-boned quality of a young animal. She understood, standing at the tree line with cold coming through her boot leather, that this was not the beginning of something. This was the middle. This had been building since before she found him in the trap, since before the trap was set, since before the empire that tried to end his bloodline made the mistake of not checking the nursery garden. She was looking at the middle of a story that was going to have an ending. The stone in her pocket went from warm to hot on the 5th day after the soldiers. She was at the workbench when it happened, labeling a bottle with the fine-pointed stylus she kept sharp for the purpose, and the heat against her thigh was immediate and unambiguous. No graduation. Warm to hot in the time it took to notice it. She dropped the stylus and reached for her coat before she had consciously formed the thought to do it. Kale was already at the north window. "How many?" she said, as if he could answer, and then looked at his body language and made her own estimate. His hackles were up. Not threat display, the raised fur of something cataloging a significant force rather than a single source. More than 10. More than the survey company. She looked at his ears. His ears were flat. "All right," she said, and her voice came out even, which surprised her. "All right, we're not going to—" She stopped. Outside. Horses. Not the sound of horses on the road. There was no road to her cabin, hadn't been since the timber company's old logging track had grown over 3 years prior. These were horses coming through the trees on the north side, which meant they had come around the township and through the forest, which meant they had not wanted to be seen from the market road, which meant they were not here to talk. She went to the door, opened it. There were 20 of them this time. The officer with winter mud eyes was not among them. The man at the front of this group was older, harder through the jaw, and wore different insignia, not the regional garrison crest she had seen on the survey soldiers. Imperial Citadel insignia, the personal enforcement arm of the Emperor's court. She knew the difference because she had made it her business to know the difference from the first winter she had been here. The way you learned which plants in a forest were edible and which killed you, because the distinction was the kind that mattered. "Liana Vale," the lead officer said. "You know the name," she said. "You have the right cabin. We've received a report of unusual wolf activity in this region of the Frostwood, specifically a silver-coated animal of non-standard size." His eyes moved past her with the professionalism of someone who had been trained not to let interest show on their face and had mostly succeeded. "We have orders to search the premises." "You have orders to search a private dwelling." "We have orders from the Imperial Citadel. The authority supersedes any regional property consideration." Liana stood in the doorway. She was one person, one not large person with no particular combat training and no weapons visible, and a collection of dried herbs and medicine bottles at her back. She was one person, and there were 20 of them, and they were on horses, and their hands were near their hilts without touching them, which was the professional way of doing it, the way that communicated intent without technically constituting a draw. She thought, in the space of a breath, about what moving aside would mean, about what they would find if she let them through the door, about the 7 wolves in the clearing and the marks under the silver fur and the howling that had come from 3 directions at once on a night when an empire's last living claim chose, finally, to be visible. She thought about Asha, running. She thought about the seer who burned everything out in one casting. She thought about what it meant to choose fully, without reservation. "No," she said. The lead officer's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees. "Ma'am, my name is Liana Vale. I've been a licensed healer in the northern region for 4 years. I have legal standing in this territory under the Coldwater Treaty of Regional Autonomy that your emperor," she put 2 fingers of weight on the word, "signed in the 2nd year of his reign and has not yet repealed because doing so would require acknowledging that the northern territories have grounds for complaint, which his court has not chosen to do yet. You do not have authority to search this dwelling without a signed regional warrant. You have citadel orders. Those are not the same thing." The 20 horses did not move. The lead officer did not move. "You are going to want to step aside," he said. "I understand what you want," she said. She did not step aside. The silence between them stretched like a line under tension, and she could feel the 20 men behind him calculating, could feel the moment that calculation was going to tip from patience to action, could feel the seconds compressing. She did not look away from the officer's face. She found something cold and clear in herself and stood in it, and the standing was not brave in the way songs describe bravery. It was not hot or fierce or triumphant. It was simply the only thing she could think of to do that she would be able to live with after. Then the light came from behind her. Not firelight, silver white, the specific brightness of something that had been held back and was no longer holding. It spilled out around her through the open doorway and hit the snow, and the horses shied. Not from threat, from something else, something that went beneath the level of training directly to the instinct underneath it. The officer's horse stepped sideways. The men behind him, who had been reaching for hilts, went very still. Liana did not turn around. She felt him beside her first, the warm weight of him pressing against her right leg. And then he was in the doorway too, framed by his own light, and the sound that came from him was not a growl. It was something that did not have a common name because nothing alive in the present era had ever heard it and needed to name it. The gathered authority of a lineage older than the empire that had tried to end it. The sound of something that had been told to be small for a very long time and had run out of reasons to comply. Every horse in the clearing went still. Every soldier went still. The lead officer stared. His face went through several things rapidly, all of them private and all of them visible. She watched him arrive at something he had been told was impossible, something the emperor had paid considerable amounts of blood and coin to ensure would remain impossible, and she watched him understand that the payment had not been sufficient. "What?" he started. "You know what?" Liana said, and her voice was very quiet. "You know exactly what. So does every man behind you, and they are going to have to decide what they do with that knowledge." She stood in the doorway of her cabin with the last alpha at her side, with silver light washing out across 20 armed soldiers and their shying horses, and the cold gray morning beyond them, and she did not step aside. The officer's hand moved, away from his hilt, down to his saddle. Two of the soldiers behind him exchanged a look that Liana caught in her peripheral vision, the specific look of men recalculating whose authority they actually answered to when the calculation that had always been theoretical became suddenly, irreversibly concrete. One of them reached for his hilt, not the officer. One of the men in the back, a younger soldier, hard-eyed and afraid, and making the mistake that afraid men made when they needed the fear to resolve into action rather than paralysis. The blade cleared the scabbard. And Kaelor, not Kael, not the cub she had carried through the snow, but Kaelor, the name that was his actual name, the name she had not known until Celine said it, made a sound that split the winter morning open, and the light under his fur became the light above it, became the light around it, and the frostwood went absolutely silent in every direction as far as sound could travel, as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. The young soldier's horse reared. The blade went into the snow. And every man present, hardened imperial soldiers with citadel authority and explicit orders from the emperor himself, found that their hands had moved away from their weapons without any conscious decision to move them. The officer stared at the silver wolf burning in the doorway of a healer's cabin at the edge of the world, and what was on his face now was not calculation or authority or professional composure. It was the look of a man watching history change direction in real time and understanding that he is going to have to choose, before the next 30 seconds are over, which side of the change he is standing on. The officer's name was Brennan Holt, and he made his choice in the space between one breath and the next. He dismounted. Not the slow, ceremonial dismount of someone making a political gesture. The practical dismount of a man who had decided that being on a horse was the wrong position for what he was about to do and corrected it without drama. His boots hit the snow, and he took 3 steps forward and stopped 8 feet from the doorway. And he looked at Kaelor, at the light, at the markings, at the gold eyes that had not moved from his face since the moment they appeared. And he went down on one knee. The snow soaked through his riding breeches immediately. He did not appear to notice. Behind him, a sound moved through the 20 men like weather moving through timber. A collective shift, a murmur that was not words but contained the shape of words, and then, one by one, and then in clusters, the sound of other men dismounting, other boots in snow. Liana counted by sound because she was not going to turn her back on any of them. Not yet. 14, 15, 17. 3 did not dismount. She marked them. Left flank, right flank, one at the back. Hilt hands. Eyes that had gone somewhere past calculation into something older and smaller and more dangerous. She marked them and filed the information and did not look at them directly because the moment they saw that she had marked them was the moment the decision would be made for them. Holt looked up from the snow. "I was at Thornwall Garrison when the orders came south," he said. His voice was level, the level of someone managing something considerable. "I was told the heir was confirmed dead. Every commander in the Northern Territories received that same communication in the first year. Varick's court issued it with seals I had no reason to doubt at 22 years old." He stopped. "I've been enforcing a lie for 16 years. Liana said nothing. "What do you need from us?" he said. She looked at Kaylor. Kaylor looked at Holt. The gold eyes did their assessment, the same deliberate cataloging she had watched him apply to rooms and tree lines and her own face on the first morning in the snow. It lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Holt held it without flinching, which told her something. "You're 3 men on horses," she said, "the ones who didn't come down." Holt did not look behind him. "I'm aware of them." "What happens to them?" "What needs to happen to them," he said, "to protect what's standing in that doorway." She heard the sound of 3 men deciding not to find out how that sentence ended. 2 sets of hoofbeats going south at speed, and then a third, and then nothing. Holt exhaled. "They'll reach a message station within 2 days, Liana said. "Yes." "Which means we have less than 2 days before the Citadel knows." "Yes." She looked at the 17 men in the snow, their knees wet, their breath coming out in plumes, their faces doing a range of things that she did not have time to fully read. She looked at the forest behind them, at the gray morning, at the stone in her pocket that had gone from hot to something past hot, to something that had no word because the word for it was not a temperature, it was a situation. "Get up," she said to all of them. "Get up and come inside. We have a great deal of planning to do and very little time to do it in." The cabin was not built for 18 people. They managed it by opening the storage lean-to at the back and removing everything that was not a crate to sit on, and by the pragmatic compression of bodies that happens when the alternative is freezing. Liana's workbench became a planning surface. Holt stood at one end of it with his hands flat on the wood and the map she kept for foraging routes spread between them, and she stood at the other end, and Kaylor sat on the workbench between them because he had jumped onto it the same way he always jumped onto it, and she was not going to pretend that was different now. Holt looked at him, once, with an expression she could not entirely read, something between professional composure and something rawer than that. "He understands," she said. "I know he understands," Holt said. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "The garrison at Coldwater has a standing order that was issued 8 months ago. Any confirmed sighting of Imperial bloodline markers is to be reported directly to the Citadel's enforcement arm and simultaneously to the regional commander of the Ash Ridge Military District." "Who is the regional commander?" "Lord Castor Vale." The name landed in the room. Several of Holt's men shifted. "You know him," Liana said. "Everyone in the north knows him." Holt's jaw tightened by a fraction. "He was Alpha House before the consolidation. Old blood, old territory claims, old—" he chose the next word carefully— "relationships with the current administration that have been mutually profitable. He reports to Varric. He reports to Varric's coin and Varric's intelligence arm, which is not entirely the same thing but is functionally identical for our purposes." He looked at the map. Ash Ridge is 40 miles southeast. If our 3 defectors make full speed to the nearest relay station and the message goes straight through without the usual garrison processing delays— 30 hours, said one of the men in the lean-to, a younger soldier with a northern accent. Kell District by the vowels. He said it like someone who had been doing the calculations since the 3 horses left. "Closer to 25, Holt said. "Vale keeps private outriders. He doesn't trust the relay system for sensitive communications." He looked at Liana. "He'll come himself. He won't send a company." "Why?" "Because if what those 3 men just saw is real, and every man in this cabin knows it is, then the value of being the one who brings the heir to the Emperor is not a value you delegate." His eyes were steady. "Vael will come. He'll come with enough force to be certain, and he'll come quickly, and he will not be interested in conversation." Kaylor made a sound, low, short, deliberately produced. They both looked at him. He placed his paw on the eastern edge of the map, the Frostwood's deep interior, the territory past the tree line that Liana had never explored, the territory the lumber company's old surveys marked as impassable in winter. "The deep Frostwood," Liana said. He pressed. "You're saying we go in?" He looked at her with those gold eyes, and she thought about the 7 wolves in the clearing, about the formation they had held, about the scarred wolf at the northern end who had lowered its head first. She thought about the howling from 3 directions, and what 3 directions meant in terms of distribution, in terms of territory coverage, in terms of numbers she did not have. "How many wolves are in the deep Frostwood?" she said, not to Kaylor, to the room. Silence. Then the man from Kell District. Old stories say the deep packs haven't been counted in living memory. The hunters from Coldwater don't go past the first tree line in winter. Something about the density of the pack territory. Something, said another man near the lean-to door, about the fact that the wolves in there don't behave like wolves. Nobody argued with that. Liana looked at Holt. We need to move before dark. Agreed. Your men are here because they chose to be. He said it without looking at them, addressing her directly. They knew what dismounting meant. They don't need a speech. She nodded. Then we leave in an hour. Take what you can carry. Leave the horses. Horses don't move through deep frostwood in this snow, and the tracks are easier to follow. She began moving. She was good at moving quickly in the cabin, 4 years of knowing exactly where everything was, giving her an efficiency that the crowded space of 18 people did not disrupt. Medicine bag. Second coat. The tin box from the hearthstone. Her notebooks. She almost didn't take them, then did, because some part of her that was still the woman who had built 4 years of careful knowledge in this place could not leave the notebooks. She was at the door with her pack when she realized Kaylor had not moved from the workbench. He was looking at the cabin, the workbench, the hanging herbs, the fire, the corner where he had slept. She understood what she was looking at. She had felt it herself, standing at the door, the specific weight of leaving a place that had been safe, a place that had been chosen rather than assigned, a place where the particular texture of ordinary life had accumulated into something that mattered. She went back to the bench, put her hand in the silver fur at his neck. I know, she said. He leaned into her hand, just for a moment. Then he jumped down and walked to the door, and she followed, and she did not look back at the cabin, because looking back at things you were leaving was a habit she could not afford to acquire. They were 4 hours into the deep frost wood when Celine stepped out of the trees. Liana stopped. Holt's hand went to his hilt, and she put hers out to stop him without looking at him. She's not a threat, she said. And then she looked at Celine, and the thing she saw in the old woman's face made the certainty of that sentence waver slightly. Not because Celine looked threatening, because Celine looked like someone carrying something she had been carrying for a long time, and had just arrived at the moment she had to put it down. You found them faster than I expected, Celine said. The stone went from warm to hot in 5 days. You said weeks. I said weeks based on the survey company's trajectory. The Citadel accelerated the timeline. She looked at Holt and his men with eyes that cataloged and moved on. You've done better than I expected with the soldiers. Holt made his own choice. I know. I've been watching. She looked at Kaylor. The same thing happened that had happened in the cabin on the first night. That mutual recognition, that sentence-finishing quality. The markings are full. Yes. Then the enchantment has 3 weeks at most before the final stage. She said it the way she said everything, without ornamentation. When the final stage begins, he will not be able to hold the shifted form. The transformation will complete regardless of circumstance or location. Liana absorbed this, and when it completes, he will be himself, fully, a teenage alpha heir in complete command of his bloodline authority. A pause. He will also be unmistakably visible to every alpha-sensitive wolf and soldier within a significant radius. The markings in human form are considerable. So we have 3 weeks to get him somewhere safe before he transforms in the open. That's one way to frame it, Celine said. Liana looked at her. What's the other way? The old woman's gray eyes moved to her and held. The other way is that you have 3 weeks to get him somewhere with enough allied forces around him that it doesn't matter who else can see the markings. The frostwood was silent around them. The sky through the canopy was the particular white of impending snow. Kaylor stood between Liana and Celine, and he was looking at Celine with his ears forward and his body still, and she had the impression, watching him, that this was a conversation he had been waiting to happen since before he had language to understand it. The deep packs, Liana said. Yes. The 7 from the clearing. Those aren't the only ones. Those were the nearest ones, the ones who came when the marks first manifested. Celine glanced into the trees. There are others, much further in, older pack lines, some of them, lines that remember the Alpha Empire before Varric, lines that have been waiting. She stopped. Waiting is perhaps too patient a word, surviving in the hope that waiting would eventually be worth it. How many? Celine looked at her for a moment, as if deciding how much the number was going to help. Enough, she said, if they accept him. If. Alpha authority is not inherited like a title. It's not a document that passes from parent to child. It's a quality that is either present or it isn't, and the deep pack lines will know within moments of contact whether what stands in front of them is genuine. She looked at Kaylor. He is genuine. But genuine and acknowledged are two different conditions, and the second requires the first to demonstrate itself under circumstances that matter. Liana understood the shape of what she was being told. He has to face something real before they'll follow. They will not follow a cub who has only been hidden and protected. They will follow an alpha who has proven what an alpha is, Holt said from behind Liana, very quietly. That's not a seer speaking. That's a strategist. Celine looked at him with something that was not quite a smile. I was both at the court. The Emperor only valued one of them. The other has been considerably more useful. She returned to Liana. There is a pack elder 3 days' walk into the deep frostwood. She is called the Grey Mother by those who know her territory, which is not many. She has kept 3 generations of her line intact through the occupation by being very careful about what she acknowledges and to whom. A pause. She will not be immediately welcoming. Because she's careful. Because she has survived by being skeptical of hope. Hope has killed more careful people than she has cared to count, and she has counted. Celine adjusted her cloak. I should tell you something else. The quality of her voice changed, not dramatically, just a degree of weight settling into it that had not been there before. Liana waited. Castor Vale received the message from your defectors 6 hours ago, not 30 hours. 6. She watched Liana's face. He had a forward position established in the Coldwater Forest Belt 3 weeks ago. Not for the Heir specifically. For me. A breath. I have been less careful than I believed I was being. He knows I survived the purge. He has been tracking my movement for 2 years. The 3 defectors reached his forward position before they reached any relay station. The cold coming down through the canopy was suddenly much more specific. 6 hours, Liana said. He will reach the Frostwood boundary by nightfall. Then we have less than a day, Celine said, before a man who has spent 16 years proving his usefulness to the Emperor by eliminating every possible complication to the consolidated reign reaches the tree line with enough force to make these 17 soldiers irrelevant. Holt was already turning, speaking low to his men, reorganizing their formation. She could hear the shift in how they moved, the compression of pace and spacing that soldiers used when urgency became a different category of thing. Kaylor was looking at Celine. Celine was looking back. I should also tell you, she said, still in that weighted voice, that I was not the only one he was tracking. Her gray eyes moved to Liana. Your name has been in the intelligence report since the survey company came back from your cabin the first time. The officer believed your story. His report did not. She stopped. Let that settle. Vale knows who you are. He knows what you chose. He knows you are with the Heir. Another stop. The worst one. And he knows that the fastest way to bring an alpha Heir to ground is not to chase him. It is to take what the Heir will not abandon. The frostwood around them was very still. Liana looked at Kaylor. He was already looking at her. She watched the gold eyes move through something. Not fear. He did not do fear the way other young things did fear, but something that lived in the same territory. Something that understood the specific weight of what Celine had just described. The weight of being a reason. The weight of being the thing that someone else was willing to die for. And knowing that the someone else had not signed up for that particular cost and could not now be protected from it, because protecting her from it would require abandoning what she was protecting, and neither of them was going to do that. She understood, in the specific cold clarity of that moment, that she had stopped being a bystander to this story at some point she had not noticed while it was happening. She was not a healer who had made a compassionate choice. She was not peripheral to the Heir's survival. She was load-bearing. She was the thing that an empire's last hope would not leave behind, which made her, by Vale's logic, the lever. The ground she was standing on was not the ground she had been standing on 6 weeks ago. She reached into the silver fur at Kaylor's neck, once, briefly. Then she straightened and looked at Celine. "Tell me about the Grey Mother," she said. "Everything. We walk while you talk." They walked. Above them, through the canopy, the first snow of the day began to fall. Behind them, somewhere past the tree line, Castor Vale was already moving, and Lyanna Vale, healer, Frostwood resident, woman who had made a choice on a frozen morning without knowing what the choice would cost, put one foot in front of the other into the deep forest and felt the full weight of it settle across her shoulders. Not crushing, not yet, but real and permanent and entirely her own. They reached the Grey Mother's territory at dusk on the second day. Celine had described it as a place they would feel before they saw, and she was right. The timber changed first. Older growth. The massive northern pines that took 2 centuries to reach their current diameter. The kind of trees that predated the Empire by enough time that the Empire was a recent event to them. Then the quality of silence changed. Not the absence of sound, but the management of it. The specific silence of a space that was occupied and knew it was occupied and was watching without announcing the watching. Holt's men felt it. She saw it move through them the way cold moved through inadequate clothing. Not dramatic, just the gradual conviction that the environment had become something different from what it had been. Kaylor walked ahead of all of them. He had been doing that since the second hour of the first day's walk, drifting forward from the group's center to its front without being told, without it being discussed. Holt had watched it happen and said nothing, which was the right call. The deep pack lines were in these trees. What walked at the front of the group mattered. The Grey Mother came to them at the boundary of a frozen creek. She was enormous. Not merely large for a wolf, genuinely enormous. The kind of size that stopped being explicable through ordinary nutrition and terrain and started suggesting something else, something older in the bloodline. Her coat was the absolute white of very old snow, not gray streaked to white, but uniformly white, with a density of fur that made her look even larger than her actual dimensions. Her eyes were amber, not gold. The distinction was significant, and Lyanna noted it. The eyes of a matriarch rather than a bloodline heir. Authority earned over decades rather than inherited. She stopped at the creek's edge. Kaylor stopped 10 feet from the water. They looked at each other for a long time, long enough that Lyanna counted her own heartbeats and lost count past 30. The rest of the group had gone still behind her. Holt was breathing very carefully to her right. Then the Grey Mother stepped onto the ice. She crossed the creek in 6 deliberate strides and stopped 2 feet from Kaylor, and she lowered her enormous head until her muzzle was level with his, and she breathed him in. Long and thorough, the professional examination of someone who had been given a description and was now checking it against the original. Kaylor held completely still. The markings under his fur brightened, not blazing, a controlled brightening, the specific modulation of something that was making itself legible rather than making itself impressive. The difference mattered. Lyanna understood it in the same way she understood the difference between a healer who told patients what they needed to hear and one who told them what was true. One was performance, one was the thing itself, and the thing itself had a different quality in the room. The Grey Mother raised her head. She made no sound. She turned and walked back across the ice and into the tree line and did not look behind her. Celine exhaled. The sound was small and controlled and told Lyanna that whatever the old woman had been holding for the duration of that 30-second examination had been considerable. "She accepts him," Lyanna said. "She accepts his blood." Celine's voice was careful. "The acceptance of his authority is a separate matter that she will determine for herself over time." She began walking toward the creek. "But we are permitted entry. Tonight, that is enough." The Deep Pack's territory was larger than anything the maps Lyanna had seen suggested was possible. 3 hours past the Grey Mother's boundary creek, and the evidence of occupation was everywhere. Scent markings on the old timber, tracks in the snow in numbers that started to become difficult to count, the sounds of distant movement through the trees that came from too many directions simultaneously to be a small group. This was not a surviving remnant. This was a population. They had been in here the whole time, the whole 16 years, and nobody outside had known because nobody willing to report it had gone far enough inside to find it, and the ones who did go far enough inside had not come back, which Liana chose not to examine too closely. They were given a large shelter, a long structure built into the hillside at the territory's center, timber-roofed, open-fronted but positioned against the wind so that the opening faced south and the structure held heat reasonably well. Not luxury, adequate, which in the deep frostwood in winter was its own form of abundance. Holt organized his men with the efficiency of someone who had been managing groups in the field for a long time and knew that the first priority when forward movement stopped was to prevent the accumulated tension from turning inward. Tasks, watch rotations, something to do with the hands. The soldiers moved into it without complaint, which told her that Holt had earned the compliance that was being given to him. She sat with Kylor at the shelter's southern edge, her back against the timber, and for the first time in 2 days she was not moving. The exhaustion arrived immediately. That was how it worked. As long as forward momentum was possible, the body deferred the accounting. The moment you stopped, the bill came due. She was 31 years old. She had walked 20-some miles through deep snow over 2 days without adequate sleep, and she was not 22 anymore. Her feet were past pain and into a distant throbbing that was almost peaceful in its consistency. Kylor lay against her side, and she put her hand in his fur, and she did not sleep, but she rested, which was a different thing and was what was available. Celine sat across from her and looked into the fire that one of Holt's men had built and said nothing for a long time. Then, "He's going to need words soon." Liana looked at her. "The final transformation, when it comes..." Celine paused. "He will remember language. He has always had it underneath, but he will need to use it. He will need to address the pack elders, the allied houses, if any can be reached, eventually Vale's forces when they make contact." She watched the fire. "And he will need to do it before any of that happens with me, because there are things I should have told him years ago that I have not told him because I did not have the access." "What things?" "Who his parents were. Not what they were. Who. The kind of people they were." Her hands were still in her lap. Varick's court has controlled the historical record for 16 years. What gets told about the Alpha Emperor and Empress is controlled by people who need the record to justify a massacre. The boy is going to spend his entire reign fighting a narrative that was built specifically to make his parents seem like the kind of rulers whose removal was necessary. Liana understood. "You want to give him the other version first. I want to give him the true version before the false one is the only one he's ever heard." Celine looked at Kylor. He should know that his father used to walk the market district without a guard escort once a month, so that he could hear what people actually said rather than what they said when guards were present. He should know that his mother kept a detailed correspondence with 3 different healers in the outer territories because she was worried the court physicians had no idea what illness looked like when it was not presented to them in a palace setting. A pause. He should know that they were worth what was done to get them out of the way. Outside the shelter, somewhere in the deep trees, wolves moved through the snow. She could hear them, more than before, much more. "The pack is gathering," she said. "The markings have been visible for 2 days. The word travels faster than we do." Celine looked toward the tree line. "By morning, there will be more." "Das." She woke to Holt shaking her shoulder, which meant she had slept despite everything, and to the sound that woke her even before his hand reached her, the marker stone, which she had not thought to check since Celine told her it was already too late for the stone to matter, radiating a heat that went past the fabric of her coat and registered directly against her thigh. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious. "Contact," Holt said. "East perimeter. My watch spotted torchlight through the trees 40 minutes ago. I let you sleep as long as I could." 40 minutes? She pushed hair out of her face. "How many torches?" 30 plus, moving in an organized line, not a patrol configuration. They've spread the approach across a half-mile front." His voice was controlled. Under the control, she could hear the thing that competent soldiers sounded like when the numbers were genuinely bad. "They've done this before. This specific approach pattern is designed to prevent concentrated defense." Kylor was already standing at the shelter's open south end, looking east. The markings under his fur were blazing now, full and constant, not pulsing. His ears were forward, and his body was absolutely still. and in the gray pre-dawn light with the mark light rising through his coat, he looked like something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time and had arrived at it with complete clarity. She crossed to him, crouched down. "Listen to me," she said. He turned to look at her. "I need you to understand something before whatever is about to happen happens." She put her hands on either side of his face, the way she had done in the early days when she was checking his eyes for distress, and the gesture had carried no weight beyond the medical. Now it carried everything. "I'm not afraid. I want you to know that. I want you to know that I would make the same choice again. All of it. The trap in the snow, the soldiers at the door. All of it. You don't—" She stopped. "You don't owe me anything for that. It wasn't a transaction. Do you understand me?" His eyes on hers. "Whatever you need to do," she said. "Whatever this is going to ask of you, you do it. You don't look back at me. You don't make a different choice because of me. Whatever is yours to do, you do it completely." The gold eyes were very bright. He pressed his nose against her forehead, once the way he had done precisely once before on a night when the snow had stopped and the fire needed wood. And then he pulled back and turned toward the east tree line and made a sound that was not a call. It was an answer. To the wolves gathering in the trees around the territory's edge, to the word that had been traveling since the markings became visible, to the gray pre-dawn that held 30-plus torches in an organized line. Liana stood. Behind her, she heard the gray mother before she saw her, or rather, she heard the sound that went through Holt's soldiers, the involuntary sound of men who had thought they understood the scale of what they were standing inside of and had just been corrected. She turned. The gray mother had come, and she had not come alone. The tree line on three sides of the deep territory's central clearing held wolves. Not 7, not 17. Liana's eyes moved across the tree line and lost count and started again and lost count again. The torchlight from the approaching eastern force threw everything into a shifting amber and shadow contrast that made counting harder, but the scale was not in question. The deep packs, generations of them, alpha blood-adjacent bloodlines that had survived 16 years of occupation by going invisible in the old forest, had come out of the timber. They were standing in formation. Holt made a sound that was not words. "Now you understand," Celine said from somewhere behind them. The gray mother walked through the gathered pack to the center of the clearing and stood. She did not look at the eastern tree line. She looked at Kaelor, and Kaelor walked toward her, through the assembled wolves, and there was no performance in how he moved. No projected authority, no deliberate display. Just the walk of something that knew what it was, moving through the space that was its own. The wolves on either side of his path lowered their heads as he passed, one after another, the ripple effect of acknowledgement moving through the pack the way wind moved through grass, each wolf in sequence, until he reached the gray mother and stood before her. She put her great white head down. Liana's throat closed. East of them, through the timber, 30-plus torches moved closer. Holt came to stand at her left shoulder. He had his sword out, not raised, hanging at his side, the position of someone who had decided and was waiting for the timing to become obvious. His men were positioned. She could see it in how they'd spread across the clearing's edge, without being ordered to, the collective body knowledge of soldiers who understood what their job was. "When he shows himself," Holt said quietly, not to her, to the air, "Vale will need a moment to process what he's looking at. That moment is everything we've got." Liana said nothing. She was watching Kaelor. He had turned to face east. His back was to the gray mother and the gathered packs and the assembled force of everything that had survived to reach this moment. He was facing the torchlight. Alone at the center of the clearing, with the markings burning full white through his coat and the pre-dawn sky going from black to the first gray edge of something that was not yet light but was no longer quite dark. He stood there. And the timberline to the east opened. Castor Vale was not what she had expected from a man who had spent 16 years as the Emperor's most effective instrument in the Northern Territories. She had expected the same quality as the lead officer from the cabin, the specific hardness of someone who had learned to use authority as a substitute for every other kind of strength. Vale was not that. He was in his 50s, lean, with the weathered face of someone who had lived a meaningful part of his life outside rather than behind administrative walls. His horse was exceptional. His armor was not the black wolf crest she had expected, but something older. An Alpha House crest, she realized with a chill, one of the old houses from before the consolidation. He saw Kylor. He stopped. His horse stopped. Behind him, the 30-plus men fanned into their prepared approach formation, and then they stopped too, one by one, as the scope of what they were fanning into became legible. Hundreds of wolves at the tree line. 17 armed soldiers in a cleared position. One woman standing at the edge of the light with nothing useful in her hands. And at the center of the clearing, a silver cub the size of a small wolf burning like a coal, with imperial bloodline marks that nobody alive had seen in 16 years, burning full and constant and unmistakable through his coat. Vial's face did something. Then it went still. He dismounted. The gesture had the quality of inevitability about it, like a man who had been doing a calculation for a long time and had just arrived at the only answer the numbers could produce. He walked forward until there was 30 feet of snowy clearing between him and Kylor. He looked at the marks. He looked at the gold eyes. "I was at the Harvest Month dinner," he said. His voice carried in the clearing. It was not loud. It was very clear. "I was not at the killing. That distinction has mattered very much to me for 16 years, and I am now uncertain whether it was a meaningful distinction or a cowardice I permitted myself to maintain." He stopped. "I served Varric because the alternative was to be eliminated with everyone else who represented a threat to consolidation, and I chose not to be eliminated. I told myself that was survival." He looked at Kylor. "I'm looking at what survival looks like when someone makes a different choice, and I find the comparison uncomfortable." The clearing held. Holt had not moved. His men had not moved. The wolves at the tree line had not moved. The 30 soldiers behind Veil had not moved, and in their stillness was something she recognized from the doorway of her cabin when Holt's men dismounted, the stillness of people doing a rapid moral recalculation with inadequate notice. Veil reached up and removed the old Alpha House crest from his armor. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it in the snow at his feet. "I didn't come here to take him," he said, and then slower. "I'm not certain anymore that I came here for Varric." Behind him, one of his soldiers dismounted, then a second, then 6 more. Kylor looked at Veil across 30 feet of winter clearing, and the light from the marks was steady and constant and did not waver, and what was in the gold eyes was not triumph and was not mercy. It was the specific quality of something that has arrived at the moment it was made for and is deciding, in real time, what kind of thing it is going to be now that the decision has weight. Then the sound came from the western tree line, and everything shattered. A crossbow bolt buried itself in the snow 2 inches from Lyanna's left foot, not from Veil's men. From the western edge of the clearing, from the tree line she had not been watching, from the direction that everyone's attention had been pulled away from, because Vial's approach from the east was the approach they had prepared for. The second force. The one that Vial had not known about because it did not report to Veil. The Citadel's private enforcement arm. Not the garrison soldiers, not the regional commanders, but the Emperor's direct agents, the ones whose orders superseded everyone else's authority and who had learned over 16 years of operating in a consolidated empire that the most effective way to resolve a complicated situation was to introduce a variable that nobody present had accounted for. Lyanna moved before she had processed the decision to move. 3 steps left, away from where the bolt had landed, toward Kylor, her hands out. No weapon, and no plan, and nothing useful except the body putting itself between the thing it had decided to protect and whatever was coming next. Holt was already moving. His men were already moving. The wolves at the tree line were already moving. Vial, to her peripheral amazement, was turning to face the western tree line with his sword clearing its scabbard in a single motion, which meant he had not known about this second force, and his absence of hesitation in response to it told her everything about which calculation he had completed before he dismounted. 20 soldiers came out of the western timber, citadel crests, the black wolf with the broken chain, every one of them, and at their center, on a horse the color of old iron, without armor, wearing the kind of deliberate simplicity that cost more than ornamentation, and was designed to communicate that the person wearing it did not need ornamentation to make their authority legible. Lyanna had never seen Varric Draven in person. She knew him immediately. He looked at the clearing. At Vale, turned against him with a drawn blade. At the wolves at the tree line. At Holt's men in position. At the depth packs arrayed in the timber like a force that had been waiting for this specific morning for 16 years. His eyes moved to Kylor. He looked for a long time. Then he looked at Lyanna. At her, specifically. Not past her. At her. The way Vale's officer had looked at her at the cabin door and arrived at a calculation. But this calculation was different. This was not the calculation of a man deciding whether to believe a story. This was the calculation of a man who already knew the story and was deciding which piece to move first. "The healer," he said. His voice was nothing dramatic, just clear and cold and very deliberate. "I thought so." He did not look at Kylor again. He looked only at her. And Kylor, who had held his ground through all of it, through Vael's arrival and his soldiers' recalculation, and the shock of the second force, and the appearance of the man who had murdered his parents in a dining room when he was too young to have any memory of them, made a sound. One sound. And it was not a wolf sound at all. The light that came up through his coat went from white to silver to something that had no color in any spectrum Lyanna could name. And the air in the clearing contracted the way air contracted before a lightning strike. And every horse in the clearing shied simultaneously, and even the Emperor's iron-gray horse stepped back 2 paces, and Varric Draven, usurper, architect of everything, held his ground by what appeared to be the sheer mechanical force of his pride, refusing to allow his body to step backward in front of witnesses. And the enchantment broke. The light did not explode outward the way she had expected light to explode. It expanded, deliberately, the way a held breath releases, controlled, specific, the product of something that had been contained for a very long time, choosing the precise moment and manner of its release. The silver-white rose from Kylor's coat and spread across the snow of the clearing in a radius that moved outward at walking pace, and where it touched the ground it did not burn or scar. It simply illuminated. Every detail of the frozen earth made exact and clear. Every boot print and wolf track and fallen branch rendered with the particular precision of something seen in the moment just before dawn when the eye has adjusted to the dark and the first light arrives not as intrusion but as confirmation of what was already there. Lyanna felt it pass through her like cold water and come out the other side as something warmer. She heard Varric's horse step back. She did not look away from Kylor. The transformation was not violent. She had expected violence from it, the biological drama of a body changing its fundamental configuration, something that should by rights be loud and traumatic and hard to witness. It was not those things. It was more like watching ice become water, the slow, inevitable surrender of one state to another that had always been waiting underneath, the structure releasing rather than breaking. The silver fur did not tear or shed. It simply became other than itself, drawn back into something deeper. And what remained when it was done was a boy. 17, perhaps. Perhaps older. It was hard to judge with alpha bloodlines, which carried themselves differently in the body than common age did. Lean and tall for the form's apparent years, with silver-white hair that was the direct continuation of the coat's color rather than a human approximation of it, and eyes that were exactly the gold she had been looking at for 6 weeks and would have recognized across any distance in any light. He was wearing nothing because there was nothing for a wolf cub to have been wearing, and he was standing in deep frostwood snow in the pre-dawn of a winter morning with the marks of the imperial bloodline running down his arms and across his chest and up his throat in lines that glowed with their own light, and he did not shiver. He stood. He breathed. He looked at his hands. Lyanna moved to him. She had her cloak off her shoulders before she reached him, and she put it around him the way she had done things in the cabin, practically, without ceremony, because ceremony was a luxury of situations that had time for it, and this was not that. He let her arrange it around his shoulders, and he looked at her while she did it, and she looked back, and the 6 weeks of a different kind of language between them were present in that look in a way that did not require translation. "Kylor," she said, first time using the name aloud to his face. His voice, when it came, was rough with disuse, a voice that had not been used in the form that used it for somewhere between 11 and 17 years. Low, northern accented, the accent of the old court that she had never heard spoken except in the very old historical recordings that the archives at Coldwater kept locked in their lowest level. The accent of an empire before it was broken. "I know your name," he said. "I've known it since the first week. Celine told me everything she could tell a wolf cub." A pause, the pause of someone locating language inside a body that is remembering how to produce it. "I could understand everything. I couldn't answer." "I know," she said. "I need you to know that I knew." His gold eyes on hers, direct and unornamented. "Every choice you made. I knew what it was costing." It wasn't, "I know what you're going to say." The rough voice steadied slightly as it found its rhythm. "It wasn't a transaction, I know. I was there when you said it." The ghost of something that would become, with time and practice, a wry expression. "I was always there." Behind them, the clearing had not resolved into action. She became aware of this the way you became aware of something you had been unconsciously monitoring. The absence of the sounds that should have followed the transformation, commands, the clash of engagement, the immediate violence that the situation's arithmetic had seemed to make inevitable. She turned. Varric Draven had not moved from his horse. He was looking at Kaelor with an expression she could not read at distance and was not sure she would have been able to read up close. Not the calculation she had seen when he looked at her. Something older than calculation. Something that had calculation's shape but was made of different material. Voyle had moved during the transformation. He had moved to a position slightly ahead and to the left of Varric's horse, blade still drawn, his own soldiers arrayed at his back. The soldiers who had dismounted, all of them, now standing with that specific quality of men who have made a decision that cannot be unmade and are prepared to stand in it. Holt was on the right. The wolves held the tree line. The Citadel soldiers at Varric's back had not drawn weapons. She marked that. They had not drawn because Varric had not signaled them to draw, and Varric had not signaled because... She looked at his face again, at the thing that was not calculation, because he was doing something she had not anticipated a man of his specific history doing in this specific moment. He was thinking, not tactically, something more fundamental than tactics. The thinking of a man who has arrived at the one thing he did not build a contingency for, the one outcome his planning assumed was impossible, and is now required to decide who he actually is in its presence. Kaelor walked forward. He walked barefoot through the snow in her cloak with the marks burning on his skin and his silver hair loose around his face, and he walked without looking at Vale or Holt or the wolves or any of the assembled force that represented, in its totality, the end of everything Varric had built. He walked toward Varric's horse, and he stopped 10 feet from it, and he looked up at the man who had murdered his parents at a dinner table 18 years ago, and he said nothing. He simply waited. Varric looked down at him for a long time. "You look like your father," Varric said finally. His voice was what she expected, controlled, precise, the voice of someone who had spent decades ensuring that what his voice communicated was always exactly what he had decided to communicate, and nothing more. "Around the eyes," Kaelor said nothing. "He was a better man than I found it convenient to acknowledge," Varric said. "I want you to know that I knew that. I knew it when I planned it, and I knew it after, and I have known it every year since, in case that distinction matters to you." "Does it matter to you?" Kaelor said. The question was not sharp. It was genuine, which was worse. The question of someone who actually wanted to know the answer rather than someone using the question as a weapon. Varric was silent for long enough that the answer was in the silence regardless of what words followed it. "Yes," he said, "for what that's worth at this point." "I haven't decided yet what it's worth." Kaelor's voice had found more of its steadiness. "I'm 17 years old, and I spent 11 of those years as a wolf cub in a woman's healer cabin, and I'm standing in snow with no boots. I don't have a complete position on forgiveness yet." He looked up at Varric without heat or performance. "Get down from the horse." Varric dismounted. He stood in the snow across 10 feet of cleared ground from the boy whose entire family he had ended, and he did not reach for a weapon, and the 20 Citadel soldiers at his back did not reach for weapons because he had not signaled them to. And she understood finally that this was what absolute authority looked like from the inside. Not the authority of fear, which required constant maintenance, constant demonstration, constant vigilance against the moment it stopped being believed. The other kind, the kind that a man exercised even in his own surrender because it was the only mode he had ever operated in and did not know how to set aside even now. Kaylor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Liana. She gave him nothing. He was not looking for direction. He was locating himself in the space of the decision the way she had watched him locate himself in every room he had ever entered, precisely, without rush, with the specific patience of something that understood that placement mattered. He turned back to Varric. "Your soldiers," he said. "The ones behind you. They followed orders. Some of them were children when the orders started. Some of them have never known an empire that wasn't yours." He stopped. "I'm not my father. I can't know yet whether that's a loss or an asset, but I know that the difference between a ruler and a tyrant is not who wins. It's what they do with the people who didn't have a choice." He looked at the Citadel soldiers, each of them in turn, the gold eyes moving with that deliberate cataloging quality. "Put your weapons down, not in surrender, in the recognition that this is over and nobody else needs to die in the Frostwood today." The silence held for 3 seconds. Then the first Citadel soldier put his sword in the snow. Then the rest of them, one after another, the sound of it moving through the group like the howling had moved through the Frostwood on the night the marks first appeared, each capitulation finding the next. Varric watched this happen. He watched his own authority, the authority he had built on the architecture of fear and 17 years of relentless consolidation, release its hold on these men in the presence of something they recognized as older and more legitimate than anything he had been able to construct. He watched it, and his face did the thing it had been doing since Kaylor transformed, the thing she still could not fully read, but which she was beginning to understand was not what she had expected from a man like him. It was not rage. It was a species of grief, the grief of someone who understood, too late and too completely, the precise nature of what they had destroyed in order to build what they had built, and who was now required to stand in the wreckage of both simultaneously. He reached to his own belt. He unsheathed his blade, his personal blade, not a soldier's weapon, the kind of blade that was made for a specific person and carried a specific history. And he placed it in the snow at Kaylor's feet, point down, hilt up. He did not kneel. She had the impression that kneeling was beyond him, not from pride, but from the genuine mechanical incapacity of a man who had not bent a knee in 17 years and whose body had reorganized itself around that fact. The absence of the kneel was more honest than the kneel would have been. It was the most honest thing she had seen him do. Kaylor looked at the blade in the snow. He did not pick it up. What? The logistics of what followed belonged to Holt and Vale and Celine, who convened immediately, and with the focused energy of people who had been waiting for this exact problem to become solvable, and were not going to waste the opening. Varric was detained, not brutally, not in chains, but in the specific custody of 4 of Vale's soldiers, and the implicit custody of several hundred wolves at the tree line, which was its own kind of persuasive. The Citadel soldiers were disarmed and fed, which was Holt's pragmatic contribution to preventing the situation from reverting because hungry armed men in a cold forest made poor decisions, and he was not going to manufacture a second crisis when the first had just resolved. Liana found boots for Kaylor from the supply pack of one of Vale's men, who was close to his size. She found a second layer for under the cloak. She did these things, and he let her do them in the same way he had always let her do the practical work of keeping him intact, with a patience that was not passivity, a willingness to be cared for that was entirely distinct from helplessness. They sat at the edge of the clearing while the others worked. He was quiet for a long time. She understood the quality of the quiet. It was the quiet of someone processing the architecture of a new existence. 17 years of one mode of being, 6 weeks of a compressed transition, he could observe but not direct, and then this, a clearing in the Frostwood, an empire dissolved and not yet rebuilt, a body that was his original body and felt like that, felt like arriving somewhere he had never been but recognized absolutely. "Celine said you'd need to talk to me," she said, "before anyone else." He looked at her. "She told me the same thing." "About your parents?" "Yes." He looked at his hands again, a habit she was watching develop in real time. the specific human gesture of examining the instrument you've just been given. She told me who they were. In the shelter last night, when I couldn't answer yet. He paused. My father used to walk the market district alone. She told me. Without guards. He was working something out in his voice, in the pacing of the words. Because he wanted to know what things actually were, not what they looked like from inside a palace. A breath. I've been a wolf cub for 11 years. I know what the frostwood smells like before a storm. I know what a trap sounds like when it's been recently reset. I know what it feels like to be cold all the way through and find a fire. He stopped. I know what it is to be carried when you can't walk. She said nothing. I'm going to make mistakes, he said. I don't know how to govern. I know how to survive, and I know what it looks like when someone chooses to help something instead of walking past it. I'm going to have to build everything else from what those two things add up to. The gold eyes came to her, direct and without pretense. I need you to stay. Kaelor, not as a debt, not as a... He searched for the word, obligation you didn't choose. I'm asking. He stopped himself, started again with more precision. The Empire is going to need healers who aren't connected to palace medicine. It's going to need people who know what the outer territories look like from inside them, rather than from an administrative report. A pause. And I spent 6 weeks in a cabin with someone who carried me through the snow and told me she wasn't afraid when her hands were shaking, and I find that I'm not willing to navigate whatever this is without that person somewhere in reasonable proximity. The frostwood was warming. Not by much. It was still deep winter, and the warming was the psychological kind rather than the thermal kind, the particular quality of air in the aftermath of something enormous. The wolves had begun to disperse back into the timber, the sounds of Holt's organization carried across the clearing. She looked at him for a long time. I am not a court person, she said. I know. I don't do ceremony. I don't do title. I will not wear anything with the imperial crest on it. Noted. And I reserve the right to tell you when you're making a mistake, directly and without diplomatic softening. He looked at her with those gold eyes and the ghost of what would become. With time and practice and the slow rebuilding of an empire from its broken pieces, something very much like his father's expression when he walked the market district alone. That, he said, is specifically what I'm asking for. Varric Draven was tried in the spring at the old territorial court in Coldwater Township because Kaelor would not hold the trial in the Imperial Citadel. He said it plainly when Vial suggested the Citadel. The Citadel was where the crime had been planned. The justice should happen somewhere the crime had not been. The trial was long and thorough, and the record it produced became the historical document that replaced the one Varric's court had constructed over 17 years. Every fabricated account of the Alpha Emperor and Empress, every managed narrative of a dynasty that had needed to be removed for the Empire's stability, every calculated erasure, the trial's record named them and corrected them and entered the corrections into the permanent archive with the testimony of Celine Morrigan, who spoke for 4 days without notes. Varric was sentenced to the permanent loss of all titles, lands, and authorities, and to live out his remaining years under house custody in the northeastern territory most remote from the imperial capital. He was not executed. Kaelor made this decision and took the arguments against it without deflection and held his position. The empire I'm building, he said to Vael, who had presented the most structured case for the alternative, is not going to begin with an execution. Not because he doesn't deserve consequences. Because the kind of authority I want this empire to represent doesn't need a death to establish itself. He stopped. If it does, then what I'm building is the same thing with a different face, and that is the one outcome I am not willing to produce. Vael held his position for 30 seconds, then he bowed his head and said nothing more on the subject. The summer brought the consolidations that the military situation had made possible. Alpha houses that had bent under Varric's reign came forward, some eagerly, some cautiously, some with the specific careful dignity of people who had been surviving on compromise for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to choose rather than accommodate. Kaelor met with each of them. He did not rush the meetings, and he did not perform authority in them. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers with the specific quality of attention she recognized from the cabin. The same attention he had given to her workbench, to the hanging herbs, to the quality of silence in rooms he was memorizing rather than simply inhabiting. He was learning the Empire the way he had learned the cabin, precisely, without pretense, from the inside. The Grey Mother's packs formally pledged in midsummer, in a ceremony that Kaelor conducted in the deep frostwood rather than in the capital, because the packs had not come to him from the capital, and asking them to pledge in the capital would have been asking them to begin on different ground than they had earned. Selene said afterward that she had never seen it done that way. He said he didn't know it hadn't been done that way, which was not entirely true, but was more honest than the alternative. The ceremony at the Imperial Citadel happened in late summer. Not a coronation in the traditional sense, Kaelor had been specific about this too. Not a performance of power, not a demonstration of lineage's triumph, not a public consumption of the Empire's history, redeemed. Just the formal moment of transfer, the acknowledgement before the people who had lived under the Empire for 17 bad years that the stewardship had changed and that the change was permanent. The courtyard held thousands. She stood at the back of the raised platform with Selene and Holt, who had been given command of the northern garrison and wore his new rank with the same unornamented practicality he had worn everything else. The platform faced west, into the afternoon light, and the summer had been long enough that the light was warm rather than merely bright. Kaelor stood at the platform's front. He was in the formal dress of the Alpha Emperor, which had been found in the archive vaults where it had been stored after the massacre, meticulously preserved, which she found remarkable until Selene told her that Varric had kept it because he had considered, in the early years, the possibility of installing a more controllable claimant and wanting the regalia available. History had uses that history did not always intend. The marks were visible above the formal collar. They always would be. He had asked Selene early in the summer whether they would fade with time now that the enchantment was gone, and she had told him they would not. He had thought about that for a day and then said that he supposed it was the most honest form of identification available, which was exactly the kind of thing his father would have said, and Selene had not been able to speak for a moment. The formal words were spoken. The acknowledgments were made. The imperial crown, recovered from the same vault, the same scrupulous preservation, was brought forward by Vael, who carried it with the expression of a man who understood the specific weight of the object and its distance from the last time an Alpha Emperor had worn it. Kaelor took it from him. He did not put it on immediately. He turned to the crowd, to the thousands in the courtyard, the faces that held the full range of what people looked like when history changed around them while they were standing still. And he said, without amplification, in the plain-carrying voice of someone who had learned to make themselves heard across a frostwood clearing, "I want to tell you about a woman named Lyanna Vale." She went very still. "She is a healer. She lives and worked alone in the frostwood for 4 years before the winter I found her trap. She has no bloodline claim, no political allegiance, no military training, and no particular reason to have done what she did." He paused. "She found me in a trap in the snow on a morning when the temperature was trying to kill everything that wasn't prepared for it. She carried me home. She kept a fire. She stood in her cabin door against 20 armed soldiers with nothing in her hands and did not step aside. She walked 20 miles into the deep frostwood in the dark because she had decided and she was not going to undecide." Another pause. The thousands were very quiet. "I'm standing here because of those choices. The Empire is standing here because of those choices. Whatever this place becomes, whatever I am able to build out of what was broken, it begins with that morning. With that specific choice. One person choosing to spend the cost of giving something small and injured the chance to be what it actually was." He looked at her. She looked back. The thousands were quiet. "The highest civilian honor of the Alpha Empire," he said, "has not been awarded since my parents' reign. I'm awarding it now, the first act of this administration, before the crown, before the first decree." He did not take his eyes from hers. "Because I want the record to be clear about what this empire values and what it considers the foundation of everything that follows." Selene's hand found hers in the pause that came after. She did not have an expression for what she felt. It was too large and too specific, and too intertwined with 6 weeks of a different kind of living. The kind that happened when you stopped being only yourself and became, without choosing it, part of something that was larger than your own surviving. She had spent 4 years learning to be sufficient to herself. She had not known, until a frozen morning and a trap and a pair of gold eyes that refused to surrender, that sufficient and whole were 2 different conditions. She walked forward when Kaylor gestured. She walked forward the way she did everything, without ceremony, without performance, with the plain practical forward motion of a woman who had decided something and was going to do it. She crossed the platform and stood in front of him, and he looked at her with the gold eyes she had first seen in a frostwood trap, and would spend the rest of her life looking at across a range of distances and circumstances. And he put the honor around her neck with hands that were steady. Then he put the crown on his own head. He turned back to the thousands. He said, "No child will be hunted for their blood. No throne will stand above justice. This is the first law. Everything else follows from it." In the courtyard, someone began to make a sound. It moved through the thousands the way the howling had moved through the frostwood on the night the marks first manifested. One voice finding another and another. Not a cheer, something older and less performed than a cheer. The sound of people who have been waiting in the dark long enough that they had stopped expecting the light, and then it arrived anyway. The sound of that. Above the citadel, the golden banners rose, and somewhere beyond the city, in the deep frostwood that was already beginning to carry the first rumors of autumn in the smell of its air, wolves called to each other in the language that had no name, but which everyone present had heard once on a winter morning and had not forgotten. And the empire that had been built on a grave took its first breath under the ownership of something that had survived to earn it. Liana Vale stood on the platform in the afternoon light, with the highest honor of the Alpha Empire around her neck, and her boots in need of replacement, and her hands completely steady. And she looked out at the thousands, and thought about a frozen morning, and a pair of eyes that refused to look away, and a choice that had not felt like a choice at the time, because it was just the thing that needed to be done. She thought about what Celine had said on the night she came to the cabin, stepping out of the snow. What you've been doing, that's what you do. She thought that Celine had been right, as seers who were also strategists tended to be, and that the empire standing in the summer light around her was the completed form of what that sentence had always been trying to say. That what you chose on ordinary mornings, in the cold, when no one was watching, and the cost was yours alone to carry, that was the thing. Not the crowns, not the armies, not the bloodlines or the banners or the formal declarations before the thousands. The morning, the trap, the choice. Everything was built from that. Everything was always built from that.